Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Taku, and I'm an education journalist at Daily Maverick. If I'm a bit jittery, that's probably because of the amount of iced coffee I've had today, and also because this is my first ever webinar, so please bear with me. Tonight, we'll be talking about all things NSFAS. That's the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. Now, for those of you who may not know, NSFAS is a government state agency entity established in 1999 with the core purpose of distributing funds to students in public post-school education and training institutions. So that refers to South Africa's 26 universities and 50 TVET colleges, also known as technical vocational education and training institutions. However, over the last couple of years, NSFAS has made headlines for all the wrong reasons, including delayed payments, allegations of corruption, and concerns about mismanagement. Now there's finally a new board in place, and it's also been 10 years since the Fees Must Fall movement. So tonight, we will be addressing if NSFAS is still fulfilling its role in helping young people gain skills and graduate. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. I'm new to this topic. This is my first ever webinar. Can I handle all of this? But don't worry, I'm not here alone tonight. I have two experts who are going to help us answer these critical questions, as well as shed light on the evidence that should be driving changes in NSFAS, as well as short-term and long-term adjustments needed. First up, we have Khaya Sithole. Khaya is a chartered accountant, academic, activist, writer, and broadcaster. He provides inputs, commentary, and analysis on various social, financial, and economic issues for a range of publications and clients across the corporate landscape, civil society, and academia. Next up, we have Lesley Powell. She is an associate professor in the Adult Community Education and Training stream at the UCT School of Education. Her scholarship has largely focused on the vocational education and training, with a theoretical interest being in the ways in which learning and skills can intervene in poverty, and particularly the ways in which it can advance the conditions for meaningful and sustainable livelihoods. Lesley, Khaya, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We really want this to be an open and interactive conversation. So to our audience, please feel free to engage with us. Please drop questions, comments, and thoughts in the chat, and we'll do our best to address these throughout the sessions. Now let's dive right in. Khaya, could you briefly explain how NSFAS works on the ground? So for instance, how many students does it fund? What's the funding eligibility criteria, and what's its budget for this year?
Thank you and good evening to everyone. So essentially what NSFAS is an organization that has gone through a couple of evolutions, and the one that we're living through is the post-2018 one. So we're going to focus on the reality of what that model is. Now, firstly, NSFAS has obviously the mandate to provide financial aid to qualifying students that are involved in the secondary education system, as you said, which really gives us a canvas of 76 public institutions made up of the 26 universities and the 50 TVET colleges. And that's obviously quite a big audience to be able to work with. Now, what then becomes a very important starting point is a simple question of what is a qualifying student. And at this stage, we have essentially three types of qualifying students. We have students that fall below an annual income of 350,000 Rand. So that is the main bucket. And those are obvious students from families who, according to the policy position taken by the state right now, are probably unlikely to be able to afford their own way in higher education. So therefore, financial aid must be made available to them. So that is the first category. And that category has been in place since 2018. And before then, the number was 122,000, which is obviously a big improvement from that particular time. What we then have is that we have a second but smaller category. And these are students with disabilities for whom obviously the cost implications are a bit different given what else they might have to find as part of their normal daily lives. So their ceiling is up to 600,000 Rand. So that's the second category. What we have is a new category that's emerged in the past couple of years. And these are the students that are above 350,000 Rand, but below 600,000 Rand. So those students are then able to apply for loans. And there's also been a small improvement in those processes because obviously up until now, it wasn't really very well entrenched. So those are the three categories of students. And what then happens is that we now have a model where those students naturally have to apply to an institution of higher learning. They have to be accepted into an institution of higher learning. Then thereafter, NSFAS has to be able to distribute the funds to that particular student. It has quite a large budget in terms of, where it used to be, but probably still not enough in relation to what it tries to cover. So there's a budget of just over 50 billion rand. Now, in its iteration, what NSFAS obviously does is that it does look at everybody who applies. Not everybody qualifies. Other people either, are obviously beyond those financial ceilings that I mentioned, or for a variety of other reasons. What we do know is that last year, they said that they had funded around 798,000 students who were registered. And obviously, as they continue to make distributions and disbursements, then you end up with the reconciliation of that number. So let's call it an 800,000 strong scheme. And that split is between heavily weight in favor of universities because they tend to have the greater capacity. So that will be about 565,000 students at universities and about 235,000 students at TVET colleges. So that's the split according to 2024 data. Obviously, 2025 is still pending. So that's the size and the scale of the scheme that we're looking at. And it is obviously a scheme that is very important in aiding so many students get access onto higher education. And yeah, I'll stop at that point now.
Thanks so much, Khaya. That was very insightful. Lesley, now to you. We know that NSFAS covers more than just tuition fees. Could you break down exactly what other costs the scheme covers for students? And could you also explain the discrepancy in allowances for TVET students and university students?
Thank you, Taku, and good evening to everyone. Thanks so much to Daily Maverick for hosting this important webinar. It's really an important opportunity to talk about NSFAS. But for me, who works in the TVET space, it's also important to talk about NSFAS and the TVET colleges sector. So that's a really important question that you've asked, and I want to answer it by talking about our post-school sector as a whole. So we have this post-school sector that we describe as an inverted pyramid. So we're supposed to have a sector that kind of looks like this, with intermediate skills, TVET colleges, the broader base, and universities and higher level skills at the tip of it. But instead, we have this inverted system in that universities enroll the majority and we have a smaller amount at the bottom. So the difference between what NSFAS pays to universities and to TVET college students is quite substantial, and it's significant not only for the ways in which it impacts the individual student, but it's significant for the ways in which it impacts this inverted triangle, because it reinforces it. And in fact, our inverted triangle has gone from something like this in 2010 to something like, to something like this, with a much bigger amount of people in the university sector. So in 2024, last year, university students would get about 16,500 for the year as a living stipend, with 3,000 allocated for personal care allowances and just over 13,000 for meal allowances. TVET college students, on the other hand, would get about 10,000 a month. And this was an increase in the living stipend from 2023 when they got 6,000 a month. But it's still significantly lower than university students. And so the sensible financial choice for an impoverished student and a student would be to go to a university, because their living stipend is so much more. One of the worst cases we saw was in a block of flats where we interviewed students a few years ago, and some of the students were from the TVET college, some of them were from the local university. They were living in the same accommodation, buying their food at the same ShopRite, using the same form of transport. But in fact, the TVET college students were so significantly poorer than the university students because their living stipend was so much less. And if you look at the sector as a whole, what we saw was that in about 2011, NSFAS was funding one-to-one TVET and university students. So for every Tibet College student they funded. 2012, they funded one university student. At the moment, the budget is so much higher for university students than it is for Tibet College students. And if you look at 2020, for example, or the period between 2016 and 2020, 94 billion was spent on university students as compared to just over 16 billion on Tibet college students. So it just gives you a sense. And in 2021, NSFAS spent 5 times as much funding university students as compared to Tibet college students. So it gives you a sense of the discrepancy and the way in which NSFAS is, in fact, pushing the sector and pushing this inverted pyramid that we sit within in very strange ways, and incentivizing and post-school sector that doesn't really make sense for our country. So thanks, Taku. Thanks for that important question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And just on the stipends that TVET college students receive, is that, in your opinion, do you think that's adequate to sustain themselves or not necessarily?
Well, let me go back to the students in this block of flats. So what was telling was the degree of poverty that the Tibet college students were experiencing in relation to the university students. And this is not to suggest that university students don't experience poverty. I'm really looking at them comparatively speaking. We brought to our work that we did a study on NSFAS and student experiences of NSFAS in Tibet colleges, and we brought to that study this notion of multidimensional poverty, which is partly about economic, and it's partly also about the different aspects that affects people's lives, such as health, such as well-being, and so on. And what came out of the study, which was quite shocking, and this, you can find the study online. It was a DHET funded study. It was part of a much bigger study into Tibet colleges. What emerged from the study was that within the Tibet college sector anyway, of course, it expanded and it broadened participation, and it helped many, many people to go to attend Tibet colleges. So in the last decade, over 2.5 million young people have been supported in the Tibet college sector, and we can't take that away. That's important. It's an important contribution. But we also found that quite a number of students, particularly in what we call the poorest category of students, and rural students, their families were being pushed into debt because of NSFAS non-payment. Their families were being pushed into debt while they waited for NSFAS to approve the application. And we discovered that many of the students spoke about what they call the loan shark industry that had developed around NSFAS in order to fill in those gaps while students are waiting for their payments. We also found that it had pushed some students into transactional sexual relationships and into the grey and informal economy just to try and survive. And this was a very tricky aspect, and we tested it in a survey to see what students felt. We checked our question with student organizations so that we phrase it in a way that they thought was the way to phrase it. And it was phrased as students get pushed into awkward relationships with boyfriends who can't support them because of NSFAS. And just short of 60% of the students responded that they agreed that that was in fact the case. We also found that students' mental health is really negatively impacted. I work at a university now, and my own students, half of my one class has been is struggling at the moment, and I see the impact that it has on university students in terms of their mental health, but in the Tibet college students as well. So I think it's really important for us to start thinking about how NSFAS intervenes in poverty, and is NSFAS necessarily the best tool that we might have in our arsenal. We know in 2016 that there was a lot of arguments made for the economic as well as the social benefits of a free post-school education and training sector. And I would certainly argue that we need to go back to the drawing board when it comes to the TVET colleges sector. I would also ask why we haven't been talking about things such as the youth fund and why these discussions have just dropped off the table, you know. So thanks for that question, Takudzwa.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Lesley. Now, it's quite clear that financial aid plays a crucial role in ensuring equitable access to higher education and training. But unfortunately, NSFAS has faced severe administrative challenges that continue to undermine its effectiveness, which in turn hinders student success. Khaya, could you just expand a bit more on some of the administrative issues that are plaguing the scheme currently?
Sure, where do I start? So I think part of the problem has obviously been the different evolutions that NSFAS has undergone through in at least the past 15 years, for as long as I've been involved in the sector. And what has really been the crux of the problem is finding the right model to operate an institution which essentially has one head office, but then has to interact with 76 different institutions and at any point in time, hundreds of thousands of students. Finding the right model for such a complex organization has really been a big challenge. So what we've seen is that we had at a point in time where essentially every single institution had a dedicated NSFAS representative. We used to call them the financial aid officers, which means that there was a lot more discretion available on site, which means that those financial aid officers would simply know what the rules of eligibility are. They would look at what the applications are, and then they would obviously then say, look at these are the ones that are funded, and then thereafter you have a process of doing those payments. In some institutions, there were serious concerns around the integrity of those processes, where basically people could pay their way onto being on the NSFAS list. And in some instances, it was regarded as pervasive enough for a model of centralization to then be a preferred option of operating. Now, naturally, there are going to be limitations with the centralization model, because it then means that those that are on campus that would otherwise be able to get an immediate response to their funding status and when their payments are going to be, now have to rely on a process that is centralized at a place that they've never seen. And depending on the capacity that is available at that point in time in NSFAS, when it was still in Belleville, it would then determine what the feedback loop was going to be. The problem with the delayed feedback loop is that it has consequences on the ground. So if I do not know when my allowance might come, the question of how I actually get to eat or get to travel or even how to pay for all of my particular costs becomes a problematic one. So we've had that particular issue where we actually still don't know what the perfect model for NSFAS is. What we do know is that we do need to be able to have a system that enables all the 76 touch points, which are the 76 different institutions, to have direct line of sight onto the decisions that are being made by NSFAS on an ongoing basis. So that if the institution says, guys, we have registered 100 students, they should be able to immediately see that, yes, NSFAS has indeed validated that those 100 students are indeed to be funded. So therefore, let us kick in the process of enabling the payments to institutions and also the payments directly to students. What we've also then had is a simple, well, is that even possible given the different allocations and the different allowances that students within a single institution might have and students across institutions might have? The secondary problem that has emerged in recent years, actually it hasn't emerged in recent years because I can take you back to reports that were published as far back as 2012, is this massive deficit that exists between the teaching capacity of public institutions and the accommodation capacity of the same institutions. In simple terms, these institutions do not have enough accommodation facilities. So when they do not have enough accommodation facilities, what you then do is you inadvertently introduce a third party, and this third party is the private accommodation providers. The primary challenge with private accommodation providers is that across the 76 different institutions, there are varying philosophies on how they should engage with those private accommodation providers. Some universities do not regard it as part of the institution, so therefore they do not really have proper accreditation and oversight of those private accommodation providers. In other words, students go out and engage on their own. Other institutions have taken the initiative to say that, look, it is actually part of their broader responsibility to students to be able to know where their students are staying and whether they can vouch for that particular accommodation It is still a mixed bag, unfortunately. But what we do know is that there has now been a much stronger reliance on those private accommodation providers. It has always been there, but in recent years, NSFAS has paid greater attention onto the question of where their students are located. Now, what you then have with those private accommodation providers are a couple of challenges. One of the key challenges relates to the simple question of how much should NSFAS pay to these private accommodation providers. Different accommodation providers have different facilities that they build at different costs, that they manage and administer at different costs. So there's also no linearity there. So when you then have a universal cap, there is a possibility that some private accommodation providers will say, no, our facilities are only available at a cost that is much higher than that, which means that the question of who is to fund the gap remains an unresolved one. So when you look at the sum of those particular challenges, you would say that we've just got an operational problem. But unfortunately, what it also had are two additional problems, the policy problem and indeed the governance problem. The policy problem is really something that until FISMAS4 happened in 2015 and 2016 was something that was just not being entertained. And this was the question of, well, if you are to say that your mandate is to ensure equitable access to a post-secondary education for those that need it, how then do you have all these static variables, which is to say, for example, the qualifying criteria is only 122,000 rand. Then there was a secondary question of what happened on the 16th of December 2017, when former President Jacob Zuma then decided that, well, actually, after all of these years, it was indeed time to deliver on what his own political party had always said was their ultimate mission, to enable free higher education. Now, you have an institution that traditionally battles to actually get all of these processes done within a 365-day cycle. It was then this institution that was given 3 weeks during a holiday season to refine and rework its systems to be able to deal with the question of, well, if we are going to change our qualification criteria, how do we then roll it out? So that is not the type of thing that helps in a time of crisis. What you then had was then the secondary problem, which is unfortunately a persistence problem of the governance issues that tend to emerge from there. There is a very strong correlation between the governance problems that we've seen and the policy issues relating to the institution and also the funding model of many years, in that you've had many boards that have simply tried to do this job and found it a bridge too far for a variety of reasons. You've had chief executive officers that have been appointed, but somehow it just didn't work out. You've also had a couple of administrators who have then essentially been tasked with really tiding it through different governance structures. But again, we then tend to see that once a new board is in place and once a new CEO is in place, something somewhere along the line falls apart. And when that thing falls apart, you then essentially go back to where you were. So it is an organization that has unfortunately been caught in this total cycle of all of those triple challenges. And we're hoping that going forward, it will be able to do a bit better and to be able to manage a bit better. But unfortunately, based on the past 15 years of evidence, the skepticism that we all have is very warranted.
Thanks so much, Khaya. Just to bring in some questions, while you were speaking on the challenges, Lika is asking, are there any implementations to better NSFAS communication with students? For example, call centers.
Well, neither of us works for NSFAS, but I think what we tend to observe is that whenever NSFAS gets interrogated on how it plans or aims to improve its communication channels and engagement channels, it always says that, you know, it's working on actually making that a bit of a better process. I do think that perhaps their systems would be better placed if, again, we had some element of localized support across the different institutions, which means that the simple run-of-the-mill queries can be dealt with expeditiously, because at no point in time will NSFAS ever have the capacity at its central office to be able to address the queries of 800,000 people at any point in time. What they may end up with is some feedback, timeframes that say that a query will be addressed within a 5-day period, but we all know that a 5-day period when you have no food is a big problem. So I do think that a localized support structure that then enables the simple queries to be dealt with and then the complicated queries to be elevated is probably the best model at this particular point in time. So there isn't an answer. And what will happen is that we may say that we found the right model only to discover that there's a spike in the number of queries across a high volume institution that then absorbs the most of the capacity, and then everyone else feels neglected. So I do think that it's a communications model that the new board really needs to revisit to figure out what works best.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lesley, before you go on, there's a question here for you. It's from Asive. Asive is asking, why is it that the government is investing less on students at TVET colleges when they leave with the practical skills for their qualifications and are better equipped for the working world?
That's a really good question. Can you just repeat the name of the person who asked the question, please?
Sure, Asive.
Thanks, Asivi, for that question. It's a critical question, and it's not a question that I can answer really quickly or really easily. What we do know is that the fiscus and the treasury allocation to TVET declined significantly after 2016. So the commitment had been made to support university students, but really TVET colleges within the PSET sector took the brunt, and the budget was significantly cut after 2016 to the extent that, in fact, our enrollments in the sector had been expanding from 2010. It was a sharp curve. By 2015, the numbers had doubled. We have now been decreasing our enrollments, and we are, in fact, at the same place we were in 2012, because these are the only, because the enrollment numbers have been capped by the budget available for TVET, but from DHET. So I think it's an essential question, an important one, and a question we need to keep asking, and keep asking quite loudly, because it affects not only the skills that are available to young people, but it affects our economy, it affects so much. And so thanks a lot for that important question.
Absolutely. Thank you. And another question for you, Lesley. This one is from Duduzile. Duduzile says, please give clarity regarding TVET accommodation allowance. How many months does it cover, and how is this payment done? Is it monthly or quarterly?
Duduzile, I can't answer that question and be factually correct on it. I'm not a as Khaya said, neither of us work for NSFAS, and you would really need to get that question answered from NSFAS, and I don't dare risk answering it. I know what the annual allocation last year was, which I shared earlier. I think the bigger question is, how does NSFAS communicate with students in general? And students in general are extremely frustrated by the challenges that they have communicating with NSFAS. One of the problems is that it's left to individual students or institutions to try and get hold of NSFAS and to respond to questions. We did the study on TVET, and during the course of our study, which was, well, we reported on it last year, so it was done 2 years ago, I think in 2022, we had somebody who we set her up for the day to try and get hold of NSFAS to ask a question. She spent the entire day on the phone and could not get through to NSFAS. So I understand that NSFAS has different iterations and they are tweaking their model. But I do think that NSFAS should be including a cohort of students into their decision-making process, so that in fact dialogue can happen a lot sooner and a lot closer to the problem. Khaya, you've suggested that it might be better to have institutional capacity to manage some of this. In the TVET college sector, the institutions really struggled with trying to manage NSFAS, and in fact wanted it to be centrally managed. And there was a lot of accusations about corruption and about students not being paid. And so for the TVET colleges, they really struggle to have the capacity to do that. Managing NSFAS is a huge responsibility, and the colleges are already so hard pressed, and that they really don't have the IT systems for it, and they don't have the administrative capacity, and they don't have the staff members lying around to really play that role. So it's a tricky thing for TVET. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Khaya, here is a question for you, even though you don't work for NSFAS. It is from Janine, who is asking, how does NSFAS monitor and ensure that the textbook funding is used for that purpose? There has been a massive increase in illegal piracy in the last 5 to 6 years.
Yeah, so one of the most important things that we must acknowledge about NSFAS is that NSFAS works with students and with universities. And NSFAS at some point in time has to place some element of faith on those that it engages with, because we have to work on the assumption that a student who has asked for funding is a student who primarily wants to be educated, and an institution that has accepted a student is an institution that seeks to educate that particular student. So whilst there will be exceptions of individuals who either misuse the funds or redirect them for something else, it is not something that NSFAS can proactively monitor and manage. All they can do is that say, this is the allowance for accommodation and books. And again, in institutions where you have some institutional capacity to say, well, if you're an NSFAS student, this is where you must collect your books, and this is how that process must be run, it would make things easier. But again, with 76 different institutions that all have 76 different models, there's no uniformity and there's no linearity there. What we've seen with some of the smaller bursary programs is that they then are in a position to be able to say that, look, you go to a particular bookshop, you get an invoice that indicates that this is an invoice issued in your student name, then you get your allowance, and then after you have to provide proof of having acquired those particular books. So that is when you obviously are engaging with students who have a commitment to be educated rather than those who want to game the system. But there's only so much NSFAS can do in dealing with 800,000 students at any point in time.
Thanks for that, Khaya. Now to the current situation. We've had a rocky start to the 2025 academic year. We've already seen protests at numerous campuses across the country. We also now have a new NSFAS board. There wasn't a board from April 2024 when the former Minister of Higher Education and Training placed the scheme under administration. Lesley, to you, I wanted to ask, what do you think are the most pressing changes that need to happen to restore trust in the scheme?
Let me start off by just picking up on the conversation that you were having with Khaya. So I want to say that the idea that students are wasting NSFAS's money is really offensive. It's offensive to students and it's offensive to the poor in this country. We did a little study, which we didn't finish. We just kind of started about a year and a half, 2 years ago, where we wanted to track what NSFAS students were doing with the money that they got. And so we didn't finish it, but from the indications that we got and from our dialogues with students, this is absolutely not the case. Students are really struggling. The NSFAS allocation to university students, makes it really difficult for them to live, and even more so for TVET students. So I just wanted to say that up front. Building trust with NSFAS, that's a very difficult question to answer, because I would like to remind all of us and our viewers that in 2016, the call was for free higher education, not for free higher education for some. And so we have to go back to the drawing board and open up our dialogue about what is the role of NSFAS, how it works, and truly open it up so that students have the space to express themselves and to talk. So NSFAS has committed themselves to supporting students along the journey and also opening up space for student voice. But I haven't really seen where these spaces have occurred, and we haven't really gotten feedback from either our own students within the university sector, and nor have I heard anything from the TVET college student movement about how and where this dialogue has taken place. I think NSFAS needs to be built up in close dialogue with students and with our poorest students in the country. It plays an important role right now, and I understand the role that it plays, but I'm not sure that the administrative and compliance costs that go with NSFAS I'm not sure. I'm not an economist, so, and I'm not a chartered accountant, Khaya, so I can't do the maths on this. But I would really like somebody to do the maths on what the compliance costs are, what the operational costs are, what the addition of all these staff members are, what the institutional implications are. I know that the TVET colleges struggle. They don't have the IT systems, for example, to provide NSFAS with the registration data of students timelessly, and students are often quite angered with that. This is one aspect. It's a technical aspect. It's a low-hanging fruit. But I think we need to open up a much bigger conversation, which is not just about how NSFAS does it better, and but to look at, is NSFAS the answer to how we address the post-school education and training needs of our population, and particularly of our poorest students. It's a conversation which started in 2016 and ended with a promise that our president made then. But I really think we need to pick it up, and we need to pick it up quite soon. And I'd rather we pick it up in dialogue than actually have the students get so angered by this whole process, which I can't blame them, because we've similarly tried to help students engaging with NSFAS, and it's a really difficult process. So from our side, and what our research suggested, was that there are other challenges. So, for example, aligning NSFAS's funding cycles with the academic calendar. So, Umalusi and NSFAS schedules are not necessarily synchronized from the release of matric results to the release of TVET college students' results. And this disjuncture often means that students are not even able to enter the institution for a year, because they haven't really been able to apply timelessly. So there's a disjuncture in our whole system that I think we need to be talking about. So I'm really happy we're having this conversation because of that. Thanks, Taku.
Thanks so much. Khaya, there's a question for you. It's from Glenn. Glenn is asking, what has happened to the Sector Education and Training Authority? Do they play any role in funding tertiary education?
So we have about 21 of those particular education and training authorities. And what they do is that they are funded by what we refer to as levy payers, which are basically the institutions in that particular sector. Now, what then happens at each individual SETA is that SETA will engage with the industry and try to understand what are the most pressing needs of that particular industry. And inevitably, one of the answers is that we need more skills to be put into the system, and we also need more grants in order to be able to run workplace-based learning. So what that happens is that every SETA then applies its own mind into figuring out how much it wants to allocate onto bursaries, for example, and then it would then engage directly with universities and to be able to say that this is how much we can allocate in relation to the program that we have. Some of them have indeed established relationships with NSFAS, but it's not a universally linear program where maybe every SETA will say that, look, the industry has told us that they need 100 more skills in this particular career pathway. Please give us 100 NSFAS students so that we can fund them on your behalf. It is something that definitely needs to be explored, because obviously I think you need to be able to enforce more collaborations across state entities instead of everybody simply trying to run their own discrete program, because you end up with a distribution rather than a consolidation of resources, and that's where the wastage.
Thank you for that. Now, the issues surrounding NSFAS have dire consequences for students, both academically and personally, as you've touched on, Lesley. We've had a few weeks ago, the Deputy Minister of Higher Education and Training condemned the exploitation of vulnerable students by landlords. This came after there were some disturbing reports about landlords demanding sexual favors from students in exchange for accommodation. There's also been reports of students facing muggings, going hungry, and being unable to afford essential materials such as textbooks and toiletries. Lesley, from your experience, what do you believe are the most important steps that NSFAS needs to take to ensure that the needs of students, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, are better met by their system?
Thanks, Taku. I want to pick up on the question that you asked, Khaya. Sorry, I just want to go back to that about the seaters. And I want to flag to our audience that the seaters were not formed in a vacuum. And the seaters were really formed against the backdrop of a significant decline in our apprenticeship system. So the narrative that exists was that our first democratic government, the post-apartheid government, came in and destroyed our apprenticeship system. Not true. Our apprenticeship system has been in decline from the 1970s, as in fact it's been for the rest of the world. Apprenticeships have been in decline. And the big reason for that is because industry found it cheaper to really just poach labor rather than train their own labor. And so industry commitment to training their own workers declined, and the unions also started to lose power, and so it was harder for them to fight for that. And this has also had dire consequences for students, because it means that students are not able to bring theory and practice together in the way in which you would expect at the intermediate skill level. And to respond to your question, I want to respond to it by really talking about the extent to which industries have developed around NSFAS. So you have these industries of loan sharks, you have these industries of landlords, you have all kinds of industries that have been developing around NSFAS. Our South African people, we are a very enterprising people. Always say we don't need entrepreneurship training. We are very, very entrepreneurial. And so I think it's really interesting when you look at NSFAS, and really important when you look at NSFAS, to think about NSFAS not as an organization, not as a funding mechanism only, not as an organization only, not as an institution that's that's doing well or doing poorly, but in fact as an ecosystem. And to see NSFAS as part of this bigger ecosystem. And so that's why I'm talking about the skills ecosystem and the PSET sector and the institutional landscape and what NSFAS does for it. I think that the most important thing that NSFAS can do, one of the most important things as it exists in its current form, is to take seriously the role that it plays in shaping our higher education system. I think it's one of the most important things that it can do. I think one of the most important things it can do for our poorest students is to take seriously the fact that not everybody can. So Amartya Sen developed this concept of convergence factors in relation to social justice. And he spoke about convergence factors as being the factors that enable somebody to utilize an opportunity in a way that will expand their well-being and allow them to live a flourishing life. So not everybody is able to take up the opportunity of NSFAS as it exists today and to translate that into a qualification or into a livelihood that will expand their and their community's well-being. And so I think when it comes to when it comes to students such as rural area students, for example, and I'm thinking now of a particular student who obviously I can't name, came from the rural area in the Eastern Cape, applied to the college. In order to do that, had to come with the bags in case she was accepted, had to stand in the queue, which she did for 3 days to apply to the college. And so the dehumanization of all of that, and then had to wing it with accommodation and survival in the hope that NSFAS would eventually approve her. That gap between approval, knowing that you're accepted, needing to pay for your travel, needing to come to the college, and then the funding gap for our poorest students, it is absolutely a desperate gap. It means that they're without food, without accommodation, and in many cases without their community. So their poverty is deepened. At least at home they had their family around them, they had their friends around them, but here they have nobody because they've traveled from the rural areas. They are just here, and and so I think thinking about convergence factors and the fact that different people need different things to utilize the opportunity that's provided is very, very important. Khaya has already mapped out that NSFAS is trying to do that, but it's a big animal, and so how it does it across the sector is a big challenge for it as an institution and as an enterprise. But okay, I think I've said enough, and I hope that I've answered your question. Yeah.
That was great, Lesley. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to go with you, Khaya, first. This is a question from Akani. Akani says, this might be stupid, but in the past, NSFAS was a loan, and I do not understand why it is now a bursary, but they're still chasing the old loan students. Is this fair?
Well, as I said, NSFAS has gone through a couple of evolutions. The current one we're dealing with is 2018. So what happened on the 1st of January 2018 is that NSFAS essentially had two streams. You had streams of students who had been accepted under the loan model. So they already had loans, they had loan agreements that they had signed with NSFAS. Those are not extinguished by the directive from President Jacob Zuma. Since the 1st of January 2018, first-time entry students have then been part of the bursary scheme, provided that their family income is obviously below qualifying threshold. What has also then not been done since that particular day in December 2017 is that the NSFAS Act actually hasn't changed. So the Act still compels the Department of Higher Education and NSFAS itself to recover loans that have been distributed by NSFAS in the past. So it means that all pre-existing loans are still due and payable to NSFAS, and those that were part of the system before the 1st of January 2018 are indeed liable for those loans.
Thanks for that, Khaya. Another question for you. It's from Jamie Lee. If NSFAS made payments promptly with regards to registration fees, then NSFAS wouldn't have to pay late registration fees. These fees could be used to fund other students, no?
Well, it is actually a two-way conversation. The question that one always has to ask is, at what point in time does NSFAS have enough data to be able to say that you must distribute these funds? NSFAS also happens to be governed by very strict public procurement and public payment protocols. It means that ideally, until NSFAS can vouch for every single student that has been registered by an institution, and that student is indeed a qualifying student, they shouldn't pay anything, because what that does is that it translates onto complexities later on, irregular spending and all of those problems, which also then create all the problems. So the problem that we have is something that Lesley mentioned earlier on, is that the timeframes between the release of results by institutions, whether it's the Department of Basic Education for first years or even 76 institutions for students already within the system, and the ability for NSFAS to figure out whether you have passed and you qualify to go into the next year, or if you've been in the system for much longer than regulated, whether you still qualify under the N+1 and even the N+2 rule. There is simply not enough time between the time institutions close or Department of Education issue results versus the point in time where universities firstly know which of the NSFAS eligible students have decided to come to their institutions and which ones have indeed applied. So in recent years, there's been a shift towards saying, well, perhaps we can start with the baseline of last year in order to make those advance payments. But again, that creates complexities on its own. So I do think that it's a bigger policy conversation around just how short the timeframes are and the pressures it creates on an institution like NSFAS, particularly when you're dealing with, again, 800,000 students across 76 different discrete institutions with very varying capacity levels to provide the information on time.
Thank you for that, Khaya. Lesley, there's a question for you from Bali. Bali says, do you think NSFAS funds university students based on their status due to the differentiation of the funding between a university student and a college student?
Thank you, Bali, for that question. To be honest, I think that NSFAS funds university students more because they shout louder. And I don't think that the lower funding at two TVET colleges has really been thought through. It's just that the TVET college student population is a much smaller population and they aren't able to shout quite as loudly. So each TVET college obviously is smaller than a university. Any university in the country is a huge enterprise. And so yeah, that's my feeling. And I think it's unfortunate. I think we need to be thinking about how we what kind of country we want to live in and what kind of system we want to see. We've done brilliantly in terms of expanding participation in schooling. We've done absolutely brilliantly. People don't often talk about that and don't actually flag that the problems that we face in our post-school sector is partly as a result of how well we've done in basic education. So now all these students have moved through the schooling system and they've come out to the other side and they're saying, well, kind of what now, We want to go to university, we want to go to TVET, we want to study further. And we simply don't have enough institutions for these students. We don't have enough funding allocated to the sector in either as student support funding, such as NSFAS, or in terms of the university sector and the TVET college sector as a whole. So we've got a big systemic problem. For NSFAS, if I was to give one recommendation at this point as a really low-hanging fruit, like please do this tomorrow, besides taking cognizance of the convergence factors and implementing a sliding scale that dealt with the different needs, the differential needs that students have, those coming from a rural area, for example, those traveling into university as compared to those who live in the area of the university, it would be that NSFAS should really adhere to a fixed payment schedule and ensure predictability in the financial aid distribution. This would really, really help so that students know and can trust and can believe that on this date I will be paid. I work at a university. I know that I receive my salary on the 25th of the month. I knew on the 23rd that there was 2 days left, and I knew on the 24th just one more day left. These are things that make a difference to your mental well-being. If I was to be thinking, well, I'm not sure if they're going to pay me this month, I'm not sure if it will be paid, maybe the 5th, maybe the 28th, maybe. This is completely unacceptable. It's a way of dehumanizing the poor and dehumanizing our students across the PSET sector that are supported by NSFAS. And much as we acknowledge the contribution that NSFAS has made to enabling our students to enroll and to widen participation, it's an unacceptable dehumanization of our student body.
Thank you for that. We unfortunately are running out of time. We have about 9 minutes to go. So I am going to pose my final question to both Lesley and Khaya. What immediate steps ought to be taken to address the issues with NSFAS? We can start with you, Lesley.
I've said it quite a few times during our discussion, so you know that I'm going to say that we need a much bigger discussion about how we address poverty and how we think about social justice in the country. So I think I'll stand with that. And maybe one more comment. I was talking to a Chinese colleague who specializes in TVET recently, and I asked her, what can South Africa learn from China? And her response was, increase state commitment to building TVET. And I said, oh, thank you. And then I asked her again, second question, so what else can we learn from China? And she said, again, increase state commitment to building TVET. So I think I'll close there, and thank you very much, Taku.
Thank you. Khaya, over to you.
So I think obviously the critical importance of the institution cannot be overestimated. Everyone understands that it's an important institution. I think what is probably the key challenge these days is to figure out what the sum of the lessons of the past 15 years has taught those that are in power, and whether they can then put together a model, an operational model, and a governance model that makes this institution fit for purpose, and also be able to figure out how to then deal with some of the underlying contextual factors that actually ultimately affect the performance of NSFAS students, because until we address those, we are going to end up in this perpetual trap of just too many students feeling frustrated and neglected by the system. And I don't believe that that's desirable, particularly when we know how important access to higher education is in terms of improving the employment prospects of young people.
Thanks so much. It's quite clear that NSFAS has a critical role to play. It has played with many issues, and there's many questions that we didn't get to. Rest assured to everyone in the audience that in the write-up, we will address some of the questions that popped up in the chat. I just want to say a huge thank you to Lesley and Khaya for availing yourself of this. Your insights to this were incredibly helpful. Also, thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. Your engagement make these conversations so much more enjoyable and meaningful. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to encourage all of you tuning in today to keep this conversation going. Whether you're a student, a parent, an activist, an educator, or just someone who's invested in the future of higher education, your voice matters. The conversation shouldn't end here, and we should all continue working towards a better NSFAS and a more accessible education system for us all. Thank you so much once again for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.